Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Monday, April the 19th, 2021. I'm going to start off today by talking about a British hero, or English hero, to be more precise. This is from the Daily Mail. Sir Keir Starmer, who is the head of the Labour Party in Britain, an opposition leader, was thrown out of a pub today after being confronted by a Labour-supporting landlord furious that he supported the lockdown, which had closed his business for months. In astonishing scenes in Bath today, Rod Humphreys, the lockdown skeptic landlord of the Raven, had to be held back by the opposition leader's security guards as he demanded he leave, shouting, "That man is not allowed in my pub and get out of my pub." The incident was captured on camera by reporters amid a visit to the city to support West of England Metro mayoral candidate Dan Norris ahead of the forthcoming elections. The bust-up comes as the Labour leader's popularity among voters has plunged to its lowest level, and Sir Keir's Labour struggles in the polls amid a surge in support for Boris Johnson's Conservatives, boosted by the vaccine rollout, with the Tories enjoying a 14-point lead. Humphreys had clashed with Sir Keir outside the Raven, accusing him of having failed to be the opposition by supporting the lockdown and backing plans to make school children wear masks. As the politician paused, the landlord waved a piece of paper at him, saying, "Do you know what the average age of death with COVID is? According to the Office for National Statistics, it's 82 years and 3 months. The average age of death normally, 81 years. Do you understand that we have effed our economy because old people are dying?" As Sir Keir tried to walk away, he continued, No, I came here to speak to this man, not your security. You have failed me. I've been a Labour voter my entire life. You have failed to be the opposition. You have failed to ask whether lockdown was functioning. Do you understand? Thousands of people have died because you failed to do your job and ask the real questions." Finally, Sir Keir stopped and confronted him, pointing out that the work done by the NHS in the pandemic, including his wife, Victoria, who is a nurse. He said that they had been completely overwhelmed with cases, adding, "They have been on the front line keeping people alive, so I really don't need lectures from you about this pandemic. Thank you. Shall we go in?" This prompted the scenes in which Humphreys demanded the Labour leader leave the pub. Sir Keir, who was wearing a black face mask while inside, left the pub following the confrontation, accompanied by members of his team. Later, the landlord, who said he does not agree with coronavirus lockdowns, said, "He walked into my pub without asking and I threw him out. Or at least I did my best to throw him out. His security got in the way." On why he asked Sir Keir to leave, he added, "I had heard that the Labour Party were coming round and he turned up and I told him what I thought of him, basically. I think he has utterly failed us as the leader of the opposition. He has completely failed to ask the questions we need asking, like, why did we throw away our previous pandemic preparedness? Why have we accepted lockdown? Why have we just accepted the loss of all our freedoms?" Speaking afterwards, Humphreys added, "He was outside, so I went and politely waited till I got his attention. He listened to me, but to be honest, he didn't have much choice. He then said something I thought was patronizing about his niece being on the front line. He looked a little bit pissed off that it wasn't necessarily smooth sailing. Then he walked past me and went to the pub, and so I followed him in to eject him. I was restrained by his security, and then he left." Well, I suppose a lot of people are asking, what can we do? Those of us who are opposed to this madness, to this tyranny. Well, one thing we can do is to stop being nice to the tyrants who have gained control of our lives. Just tell them what you think of them whenever you have an opportunity. They're not used to people telling them the truth, to telling them their true feelings. And all this talk about the front line. Oh, we're at war with a virus. Are we? I mean, they would be pathetic if it wasn't so stupid. Okay. Moving on. Growing calls for Ontario Premier Doug Ford to resign amid worsening COVID-19 third wave. Amid a public health crisis, the likes of which Ontario has never seen, and a firestorm of criticism regarding the Ford government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are growing calls for the Premier to step down. This is from Travis Danraj at Global News. On Sunday, a Washington Post op-ed by columnist David Moscrop titled "Doug Ford Must Resign" quickly became the most read story on the paper's website. In the article, Moscrop wrote, "Over a year into the pandemic, things are worse in Ontario than they have been since it began." The column is scathing when it comes to Ford's ability to lead the province moving forward. Getting rid of a premier with a majority government is difficult outside of an election, but Ontarians cannot wait to hold Ford accountable at the ballot box. A caucus revolt might do it, but even without one, for the good of the province and his own party, Ford should catch the next train to political oblivion, Moscrop wrote. The leader of Ontario's official opposition, Andrea Horwath, told Global News Monday, of course Doug Ford should resign. He refused to listen to experts and instead marched us into a brutal, horrifying, and deadly third wave. People are losing their lives, people who would otherwise have made it through this. Ontario deserves so much better, Horwath continued. Also on Monday, Ontario Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca issued a press release calling for Ford's resignation, writing bluntly, "Doug Ford is the worst premier in Ontario history at a time when leadership matters most." So these people are calling for Doug Ford to resign. And why? Why are they doing this? They're doing it because apparently Doug Ford has not been dictatorial enough. Apparently, 13 months ago, he should have welded all Ontarians into their homes and not let them out. It's funny that these people who are calling for Ford to resign still manage to keep their jobs. It's amusing. They are all essential workers, apparently. For some reason, I'm not seeing the chat here, and I don't know why. I don't know what I can do about that. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what has happened. Let's see. This is from the Hill Times, Mike Lapointe. Canada's most populous province is facing an increasingly uphill battle in reining in the pandemic, with new cases of COVID-19 hitting all-time highs last week. Intensive care units stretched to capacity, and what a number of Ontario MPs describe as confusion, frustration, and anger with the vaccine rollout among their constituents. Ontario recorded 4,250 new COVID-19 cases April the 18th, down from 4,362 April 17th, during a weekend that saw 52 deaths. Once again, I'm going to have to point out exactly how many people live in the province of Ontario, which is Canada's most populous. And it is 14.8 million people. Now, I understand that journalists have a great difficulty with math and statistics, but they continue to carry on as if the bubonic plague has somehow struck Ontario. "We're losing the battle between the variants and the vaccines," said Ontario Premier Doug Ford in a late Friday afternoon press conference, April 16th, when he announced additional measures to try and stem the third wave of the pandemic, including extending the stay-at-home order by 2 weeks and limiting travel between provinces. "The pace of our vaccine supply has not kept up with the spread of the COVID variants. We are on our heels, but if we dig in, remain steadfast, we can turn this around." That's exactly what he said when he announced the first lockdown, and exactly what he said when he announced the second lockdown, and is exactly what he will say when he announces all of the further lockdowns. It doesn't seem to have occurred to him or to any of the other leaders in the West that lockdowns don't work. They only make things worse. On April 18th, the Prime Minister's office said the federal government would provide emergency support to fight the outbreak in the province, including sending federal healthcare staff and equipment to the front lines and into the most impacted areas, boosting rapid testing, investing $84 million to support voluntary safe isolation sites, and providing additional supplies of drugs reallocated from other provinces and territories. When asked what he was hearing from his constituents in the midst of rising case counts and the vaccine rollout, Liberal MP Adam Vaughan said a great deal of frustration, which is fueled by as much anger as it is by confusion. Vaughan said that when we look at the vaccine rollout in particular, the latest chapter in a set of very frustrating policies coming out of the province who have responsibilities here, we keep being told that it's a supply issue. This is from the Post Millennial, April the 16th. Ford government will likely not announce curfew measures. Well, yeah, that's a funny way to put it, given that essentially everyone in Ontario, except, essential people like Doug Ford, have been put on curfew. A source confirmed to CP24 that the Ford press conference penned for 2:30 p.m. on Friday will not include the announcement of a curfew, despite the province having another record-setting day in cases, logging nearly 5,000 on Friday once again. Other public health measures were discussed, however, including the shutting down of construction projects deemed non-essential and fining businesses who refuse to let eligible employees work from home. Yes, the Ford government announced last Friday that the police were given powers to arrest people who they found on the street without good reason. Ian Miles Chong reports for the Post Millennial, the Ontario government is backpedaling on its enhanced COVID-19 restrictions that allow police to randomly stop and question people for being outdoors. Under the widely criticized rule, police would have been allowed to stop people without cause. The rule has been changed for the fourth time in as many weeks in response to the province's changing efforts to tackle the pandemic. On Friday, Premier Ford announced public health measures that were in accordance with proposals made by Ontario's Science Table, but angered mayors, police forces, and civil liberties group. The rule received widespread opposition from the public, and 39 out of 45 police agencies in Ontario said they would not abide by the imposition on civil liberties. Earlier Saturday, the government backtracked on its playground restriction rules following a public backlash. And there's a tweet from Doug Ford. 2 weeks ago, Ontario's enhanced restrictions were always intended to stop large gatherings where spread can happen. Our regulations will be amended to allow playgrounds, but gatherings outside will still be enforced. Play outside safely. Parents, keep your distance and wear masks if you can't. Stephen Warner, the spokesman for Solicitor General Sylvia Jones, said in a statement that the government has refocused the powers it provided police forces. If a police officer or other provincial offences officers has reason to suspect that you are participating in an organized public event or social gathering, they may require you to provide information to ensure you are complying with restrictions. Every individual who is required to provide a police officer or other provincial offences officers with information shall promptly comply. Yes, said Commissar Sylvia Jones. The previous wording allowed police officers to stop and question Ontarians outdoors without cause or reason. Under the amended wording, police must have reason to suspect that an individual may be participating in a gathering that is prohibited and may require the individual to provide information for the purpose of determining whether they are in compliance with the rule. As detailed by Andrew Lawton on Twitter, police have nearly been unanimous in saying they prefer education to enforcement. This was very much reiterated today, as evidenced by the 39 police departments on this list saying they wouldn't resort to random detention and questioning. And finally, from the post-millennium, we have a piece by Spencer Fernando. If you're not willing to comply, then you are breaking the law. That's what the government is telling people. And what does that refer to? It refers to what would happen if someone refuses to tell the police why they are outside. That's right. The Doug Ford Conservative government has empowered the police to stop anyone who is outside for any time for any reason. The police have the power to demand you explain to them why you are outside. If you refuse, they tell you that you are breaking the law and can be punished. Fascism is here in Canada right now. This is insane. This is clearly an assault on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with Doug Ford going 100% all in an authoritarian police state policy. And the reaction to this police state imposition is demonstrating that a tipping point has been reached. Yeah, well, I wonder what would happen if this went to court, because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms means whatever judges think it means. Ben Woodfinden had tweeted on April the 16th, "Sorry, no, I'm done. This crosses the line. Fight this." I know a few PC MPPs follow me here. I know a few of you personally. You've got to draw a line here. Someone is breaking the law and will be punished by the police if a police officer decides you're outside for a non-essential reason. This is Ontario. Please don't do this. Peter McCaffrey wrote on Twitter, "I've tried really hard to stay out of the conspiracy theory, slippery slope stuff, but the government just keeps piling on more and more rules, and when they don't work, they add more and so on. So this is the inevitable conclusion." Christine Elliott just says, "Parks are closed because people are not wearing masks in parks is why we're seeing increased transmission." That is not true. Oh, and it might get even worse. In Canada, martial law is being discussed. Yes, of course, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre, imposed martial law on Canada, on all of Canada, in 1970 because 2 people had been kidnapped in the province of Quebec. This is from Global News. Emerald Bensedin. Procurement Minister Anita Anand isn't ruling out any options that could help Canada curb its third wave of COVID-19, including invoking the Canada Emergencies Act. When asked about whether Canada would be considering the act on Sunday, she told the West Bloc's Mercedes Stephenson federal cabinet would reconvene over the weekend and again early next week to consider all options. The Canada Emergencies Act would give the federal government the power to issue executive orders and reallocate public funds quickly following a parliamentary review. Canada stopped short of declaring a federal emergency during the first wave last year, but plenty of provinces have already declared public health emergencies and invoked emergency measures. The act itself has never been used in Canada. The now repealed War Measures Act, which allowed the federal government to take action to ensure safety and security during national emergencies, has been invoked 3 times in Canada during the First and Second World Wars and during the October crisis of 1970, when Front de Libération du Québec members abducted then provincial Deputy Premier Pierre Laporte and British diplomat James Cross. Anand's comments come at the heels of a bleak moment for Canada's pandemic response. The country is undergoing a severe third wave driven by new, more transmissible variants of the coronavirus that are threatening to overwhelm Canada's healthcare systems. Many provinces are locking down after reporting record high daily cases of the virus. Yes, and strangely enough, or not strangely, there's all this talk about cases in all these stories, but they are not talking about deaths. If people have a disease which doesn't make them ill, then how serious is this disease actually? More from Matt Gurney at TVO. There is no one at the wheel in Ontario. The government has been completely overtaken by events and lost control, not only of the crisis, but of itself. Where the hell do I even begin? Wow, this panic porn. It's been, these are heady days for journalists. Every day they can sit at their keyboards and talk about the end of the world. That's not really a rhetorical question, Gurney continues. The past 72 hours in Ontario have been, with no exaggeration, the most bizarre 3 days I've ever covered or even witnessed. There are 4 or 5 different columns I could write about, and all would cover some entirely distinct, eye-popping angle. There's the dozens of police forces refuse Premier's offer of power to arbitrarily stop and interrogate any citizen without limit column. There's an entire column about what the new police powers, even the lesser revised versions, mean. There's a border closure column. There's a column about the insanity of closing playgrounds. There's a column about the volcanic eruption of public anger after the new emergency measures were announced on Friday. You could do an entirely separate one just on the astonishing outpouring of on-background only and off-the-record wailing and horror by progressive conservatives themselves, the likes of which I've never seen. If there's any meta-theme to be pulled from all of this weekend's complete bonkers insanity, it's that Premier Doug Ford and his government can no longer even pretend to be in control. The curtain fell sometime between Friday and Saturday afternoons. It's not that there wasn't warning. There have been signs of growing panic for weeks as whatever inexplicable hope this government might have clung to that we'd been spared a major third wave had collided bodily with the reality of a hospital system just trying to avoid a catastrophic collapse. You see, the planted axiom here from Matt Gurney and all these other journalists is that apparently Premier Ford didn't order coronavirus, COVID-19, to go away. If he'd just done that, then Ontario wouldn't be in this mess, which is pretty much the same mess as all the other places in the world which have put on lockdowns over and over again. And, let's see, in more normal times, editorial boards and columnists would be calling for the government to resign, to step down to disgrace, purge a bunch of the top officials, starting with the premier, and face the voters. It's been interesting to see how little of that there has been over the past few days. That's because our politicians are no longer considered responsible for anything that they do. Oh, the experts told us to do that. Well, these experts weren't elected to political power. The politicians would. But our politicians now are content to hide behind the skirts of public health experts. And Matt Gurney is apparently very put out, again, because Ford was simply not draconian enough. Yes, let's just order COVID-19 to step down. And this apparently is why people are angry with Doug Ford. Anthony Fury writes in The Sun, the Ford government backed down, but where was the apology? The outrage came fast and fierce on Friday when Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced the latest round of restrictions that included closing playgrounds and recreational park space, banning people from socializing outdoors with non-family members, and giving the police the power to stop anyone to ask where they're going. Criticism poured in from doctors, legal analysts, politicians, and of course, regular citizens. Dozens of police services from communities large and small stepped forward to say they wouldn't be engaging in random stops. But perhaps the biggest snub to the Ford government came in the form of protests from the people of Ontario. It seems every Ontarian put their foot down to say no. This didn't come in the form of organized protests where people met in large groups chanting and waving signs, although that happened as well. Hundreds of people showed up to Queen's Park for what has become a regular weekly protest gathering to make their voices heard and then take to the streets for an essential exercise march. Their numbers, though, were no greater than what they'd been in weeks prior. To find the bigger protest, all you needed to do was drive around or walk down the street to notice that there were a million little protests happening all over the place. Regular Ontarians were just totally ignoring the new rules and doing what they pleased. There were children playing in most of the playgrounds I passed. One series of tennis courts I walked by had 3 or 4 courts in use. Friends waited in line with each other for lattes in front of their local coffee shops. Small groups of people hung out together, chatting in public spaces. People were having none of it. Stay at home on a nice spring day like this, thanks, but no thanks. Many of them surely knew they were engaging in little acts of civil disobedience, but some of them probably didn't, having long tuned out the now constant stream of ever-changing edicts. For some people, all the new rules probably did was just push them further underground and into more risky conditions. It was not a surprise that the government walked back the more egregious aspects of the hastily considered rules. On Saturday, Ford posted to social media that they would ditch the random stop measures and the closure of playgrounds, although still keep the other unjustified restrictions on outdoor activities. What they should have done was admit they were wrong and apologize to the people of Ontario. That's what German Chancellor Angela Merkel did last month after initially mandating a 5-day shutdown of the country over the Easter holiday. The country erupted in outrage, and Merkel called her decision a mistake multiple times and begged Germans for forgiveness. It was a rare example of humility during a time of government overreach, and Ford and his government would have generated a lot of goodwill if they had followed Merkel's lead. Alas, no. Nobody was willing to appear before the cameras to own up for what happened. Instead, Solicitor General Sylvia Jones sent out a release explaining that they were merely refocusing their restrictions towards policing those who are participating in an organized public event or social gathering, yes, including outdoor ones, without any acknowledgement that maybe they just messed up royally and irreparably damaged public trust. Still, it was a remarkable 24 hours, one where the people of Ontario, through both their outrage and their quiet gestures of protest, collectively said no and got the government to back down. So, yes, apparently Ontario is something of an outlier in the world, but it turns out that it is not. This is from Sam Meredith at CNBC. Chile has one of the world's best vaccination rates. COVID is surging there anyway. Chile has endured a sharp uptick in COVID infections in recent weeks, even with its world-renowned vaccine rollout and strict lockdowns in place. I should point out that Chile is using vaccine from China, which has been proved to be, well, mostly useless. At worst, it has a 3% success rate, and at best, 50%. So, yeah, they did everything they were supposed to do in Chile, but somehow you just can't order a virus to stop acting like a virus. I'll go to Lockdown Skeptics here. Britain records lowest daily COVID death toll since the start of September. India added to red list over new variant concerns. The war on pubs is being waged by Puritans against joy. And I'm going to read this essay from Lockdown Skeptics by Sean Walsh. Hugh Osmond and Sacha Lord are back in court this week to argue that the government's refusal to reopen indoor hospitality is inconsistent with the opening up of non-essential retail. I wish them luck, I really do. But I fear that they're battling not against sage evidence, but against the miserable assumptions on which that evidence is based. Why has this government gone to war on pubs when the hospitality industry was last year responsible for fewer than 3% of COVID infections? It's tempting to conclude that the sage types are not worried that pubs are possible vectors of transmission, but that they are concerned that hospitality venues are potential theaters of dissent, or worse, that they are places where people have the temerity to enjoy themselves. Heaven forfend. The lockdown Sanhedrin, the sage clerisy, is itself infected with the virus of Puritanism. It's impossible to look at Chris Whitty without concluding that other people's enjoyment presents itself to him as a sort of personal kryptonite. Boris Johnson's self-announced libertarianism seems to amount to little more than the thesis that he gets to do what he wants and the rest of us can go hang. But I think it goes deeper than that. The government, and in particular its advisors, are enthralled to a metaphysics of joylessness. At the start of this crisis, the government decided that it was qualified to make a distinction between those activities which are essential and those which are not. The latter were consequently eliminated from the list of what was permitted. To put it another way, it took upon itself the right to decide what counts as work and what counts as mere play. But it is not clear that any such distinction exists, and if it does, then it does not follow that we should prioritize work over play, even in a pandemic. Aristotle claimed that the first principle of activity is leisure, that we work in order to play, that play is a more valuable activity than work because it is something that is done for its own sake. The vulgar utilitarianism, which has shaped Sage's pandemic response, is a crude sanitization of our understanding of the human soul. Not every worthwhile thing that we do as human persons can be reduced to the requirements of a Downing Street data slide. Pubs matter for reasons that go further than the economics of the hospitality sector, important those they are. They matter because they are playgrounds for adults. They are important because they remind us that not everything has to be geared to the puritanical assumption that we work only to get up and repeat the same day. And they matter because they have their own internal social grammar, one which has been handed down from generation to generation. The pub has its own set of protocols, the round, and its own systems of internal conflict resolution. Let's take this outside. It is in the pub that people can whisper conspiracy against a government narrative, and conspiracies always require that the like-minded are allowed to gather. It is over a drink that the millionaire and the pauper can come together and compare notes. Johnson is currently offering us a sinister inversion of what a pub is, one in which you are tracked, traced, audited, judged, and humiliated. The roadmap in this industry, at least, is one that leads you not into normal, but into a Twin Peaks version of it. And Sean Walsh concludes, this government needs to be careful. I'm not persuaded that it has gone to war against us, but it's starting to give that impression. Why? Because if you were given carte blanche to construct a police state, this is how you would do it. You would stamp on the enjoyment of the great unwashed and confiscate all mechanisms of dissent. The government's war on pubs is ticking both those boxes. And as usual, we'll end the COVID segment with a look at Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. Today, great moments in CNN history. Americans don't need masks. They buy them because they're scared. Chinese Americans buy masks for families overseas. For the East Asian diaspora in the U.S., buying masks is a necessity for family members abroad. In the same story. Let me work through this, if I may. Buying masks if you're American means you're scared. But buying masks if you're Chinese or Chinese American is part of your great patriotic duty or just a sign of respect for your family back home. Walter Kern, who's been remarkably sane throughout this ordeal, tweeted, recently flew to New York City, 2 legs, 1 airline. First plane was almost empty, and there were PA announcements about distancing protocols and airlines' commitment to health, etc. Next flight was sold out. No PA jive. Flight attendants told anxious passengers to take another flight or be quiet. Berenson comments, in my most recent flights last week, the attendants largely dropped the mask theater. There was a pro forma announcement at the beginning, nothing else. They were much stricter December through February. And I learned from Alex Berenson that Yale University is requiring vaccination for all returning students. He writes, add my alma mater to the list of universities requiring COVID vaccinations. If you want to know how far U.S. higher education has gone off the rails, here's your answer. College students are at 0 risk. This is a fake answer to a fake problem. It's about safetyism and PR. And though I hope no 18-year-olds have a stroke or worse after the vaccine, if they do, I hope they sue Yale and the other universities pushing this nonsense for every dollar in their endowments. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about my home city of Victoria. I've told you several times about the homeless shelter, formerly a motel, directly across the street from where I'm staying, and it has reached absolute pandemonium there. I am awakened every morning at 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock by police sirens, ambulance sirens, women screaming, dogs barking, men shouting obscenities, etc., etc. Yesterday there appeared to be 10 cop cars and a whole bunch of ambulances. It just suggests to me that there's an awful lot of criminal activity going on at this place. But of course, the government is not going to shut it down. About 2 days ago, I went to my local Save on Foods. It's about a 15-minute walk from here to buy some groceries. And I noticed as I was checking out that there were no plastic bags. I had been away from Victoria for about 6 months a couple of years ago, and I came back and, oh, no plastic bags. What the hell's happening here? Well, apparently the City Council of Victoria, or our lesbian occupation government, had decided to ban plastic bags, with just paper bags or reusable bags if you bring them. So I learned that every time I left the house, I had to take plastic bags with me because I didn't want to be caught in a situation where I had to use paper bags. Paper bags are hard to carry. Also, it rains a lot here in Victoria. And if you are walking home with a paper bag or paper bags, they fall apart. I've actually had this happen to me in Victoria. I'm walking back to my apartment, and the bag with my groceries just falls apart, and all my groceries are on the sidewalk. Our environmentally conscious city government apparently believes that everyone drives home from the grocery store in a car. It doesn't even understand that a great many people actually walk to the grocery store and walk back. This is from the Times Colonist of Victoria, which has a little heart emoji between the Times and the Colonist because they care. After determining that reusable bags can be safely used, the City of Victoria reinstated its plastic bag bylaw on Thursday. Enforcement of the bylaw, initially adopted in 2018, was suspended in the early days of the pandemic when health officials recommended grocery stores and food retailers not allow customers to use their own bags amid fears that reusable bags could contribute to the spread of the virus. Grocery and retail stores responded by offering customers plastic or paper bags for their purchases. Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps said reinstating the bag bylaw is a simple step to help reach the city's goal to reduce waste by 50% by 2040 and produce zero waste by 2050. With the bylaw now back in effect, all businesses have the same requirements in place as previously, including restricting the use of plastic checkout bags and charging a fee for paper bags. Before the bylaw's implementation 3 years ago, it was estimated that Victorians disposed of 17 million single-use plastic bags annually. Following the City of Victoria's lead, more than 20 other municipalities across Canada, including Saanich, Esquimalt, and Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, adopted similar bylaws. Yes, apparently it is now the remit of municipal governments to make people's lives as miserable as possible. I'm looking at a story here 3 years ago from Australia. Sydney, Australia's second largest supermarket, Coles, on Wednesday halted plans to charge shoppers for plastic bags, succumbing to customer fury about a shift away from single-use plastics. Coles, owned by Wesfarmers, and its larger rival, Woolworths Group Limited, removed one-use plastic bags from stores late in June as part of a national push to reduce waste, selling reusable ones for a small fee instead. It drew a furious response, dubbed bag rage, as customers angry about having to bring their own sacks or pay 15 Australian cents for a reusable plastic bag, abused checkout staff, and vented on social media. The union, representing store workers, launched a public campaign on the issue, and both grocers capitulated, temporarily waiving the fee. Reusable bags are a bad idea. And the Washington Post noticed this some years ago, but they decided that, no, you can't trust the evidence of your eyes and your ears. Brad Plumer wrote in 2013, actually it's 8 years ago, everyone loves counterintuitive studies. They make for catchy headlines. And so last fall, when two academics posted a working paper suggesting that San Francisco's eco-friendly ban on plastic bags might actually be killing people, it was too good to ignore. The paper by Wharton's Jonathan Click and Joshua Wright found that foodborne illnesses in San Francisco increased 46% after the bag ban went into effect in 2007, with no such uptick in neighboring countries. Most likely, the authors concluded, this was due to the fact that people were putting their food into dirty, reusable bags and not washing them afterward. The kicker, our results suggest that the San Francisco ban led to, conservatively, 5.4 annual additional deaths. That sounds terrible, and it gave rise to plenty of alarming headlines. But was the conclusion actually warranted? Are plastic bag bans really keeping people? At least one public health expert is very skeptical. Yeah, how about that? Reusable bags are disease vectors. There is no other way of describing them. Let's see. Let's look at the blog of Tim Newman, White Son of the Desert, who's done valiant work on the subject of bags. He wrote in 2019, now there's a surprise, sales of bags for life rose to 1.5 billion last year as the amount of plastic used by supermarkets increased to 900,000 tons, Greenpeace research has found. Many supermarkets have stopped selling 5p single-use bags altogether in favor of stronger 10p bags, which are intended to be reused. A study by the Environment Agency concluded that these plastic bags for life needed to be used at least 4 times to ensure they contributed less to climate change than the lighter single-use bags. Newman comments, it might have been a good idea to have investigated the relative effects of different bags on the environment before lobbying idiotic politicians into passing laws banning the most useful and popular type. But as I like to point out, this is driven by emotions, not rationality. The Greenpeace and EIA research says that Bag for Life sales were cut by 90% in the Republic of Ireland by setting higher prices of 70 cents. The report recommends a charge of 70p or ideally a government ban. The charge appears to be based on that of another country, only changing the currency without even bothering with exchange rates, let alone purchasing power. I suppose we should be grateful the unwashed clowns at Greenpeace didn't take Venezuela as the test case. And what is everyone supposed to use to carry groceries if there is an outright ban on plastic bags? Repurposed drawstrong elephant scrota? The research also found that overall supermarket plastic use has risen to more than 900,000 tons in 2018, despite pledges by retailers to cut down on packaging. The previous year, they used 886,000 tons of single-use plastic packaging. The report found that supermarkets had slightly reduced the plastic from own-brand goods, but that packaging from branded goods increased. In other words, they spent years hounding the wrong part of the supply chain. These are the people who wish to be in charge of a command and control economy. Fiona Nichols, Ocean Plastics campaigner for Greenpeace UK, said, supermarkets are failing on plastics and failing their customers. We hear piecemeal supermarket announcements on plastic every other week, but in reality, they are putting more plastic on the shelves than ever. These supermarkets are failing their customers in the same way Coke dealers are failing London property developers. Only Tesco has given suppliers an ultimatum to cut plastic use or see their products removed from the shelves. Perhaps their management are not happy with the pace at which they are losing market share and wish it to quicken. Waitrose was ranked top for cutting its packaging and trying out refill stations for products such as coffee, rice, pasta, wine, and detergent. The Waitrose near me in St. Catherine Docks serves coffee in porcelain cups, but doesn't let you leave with them. In other words, it's a cafe serving people who have time to loaf around in the middle of the day drinking coffee. And we're back to London property developers again. Meanwhile, nobody seems concerned about the amount of plastic used in women's makeup. Via a reader on Twitter, an academic paper on one of this blog's favorite subjects, Tim Newman writes, the effectiveness of banning single-use plastic bags. Here's the abstract. Leakage occurs when partial regulation of consumer products results in increased consumption of these products in unregulated domains. This article quantifies plastic leakage from the banning of plastic carryout bags. Using quasi-random policy variation in California, I find the elimination of 40 million pounds of plastic carryout bags is offset by a 12 million pound increase in trash bag purchases, with small, medium, and tall trash bag sales increasing by 120, 64, and 6% respectively. The results further reveal 12 to 22% of plastic carryout bags were reused as trash bags pre-regulation and show bag bins shift consumers towards fewer but heavier bags. With a substantial proportion of carryout bags already reused in a way that avoided the manufacture and purchase of another plastic bag, policy evaluations that ignore leakage effects overstate the regulation's welfare gains. Oh, Newman comments. It might have been useful to analyze second-order effects before imposing sweeping legislation. No. The trouble is, despite environmentalists' claims to be believers in science, what we're dealing with here are religious fanatics. They've decided plastic is the devil's material, and therefore any move which appears to reduce its use sets mankind along the path of righteousness. All the academic research in the world isn't going to make a dent in the propaganda pumped out by the United Church of Modern Environmentalism. You might as well go to Mecca during the Hajj and start picking holes in bits of the Koran. That's not to say the papers and others like it aren't useful. They are vital in demonstrating that people's views on the environment are in large part spiritual, not rational. This is important because those who advocate these policies generally consider themselves atheists, whose beliefs are based on scientific data, albeit that which they'd not have the foggiest idea how to interpret without the guidance of the contemporary equivalent of a religious hierarchy. The evidence suggests it's rather pointless to tell a man who claims to be pious that his behavior suggests otherwise. But I found that there is considerable traction in admiring the spiritual commitment of so-called atheists and remarking that they'd be quite at home in a busy-bodying church. More news from Canada. Federal budget to commit more than $2 billion for childcare. Deficit not to exceed $400 billion. I know that doesn't sound like very much to Americans, but keep in mind there are only 38 million people in Canada. First budget in 2 years to focus on shoring up pandemic supports, laying groundwork for sustainable growth. Yes, $10 a day daycare. That's what's being teased. Quebec has $5 a day daycare, which is paid for, well, by the Western provinces. It's not paid for by Quebecers. So $5 a day daycare, $10 a day daycare. This is an incentive for women to stop looking after their children and have their children looked after by strangers. I recall some years ago reading a piece by a woman who was the editor of the Financial Post, railing against women who actually looked after their own children, essentially, and pretty much exactly calling them traitors to the gross domestic product. Here you see the great coalition between capitalism and feminism. Feminists don't want mothers looking after their own children. It's wicked somehow. And capitalists don't want women looking after their own children because putting women in the workforce, and last year there were more women than men in the workforce of the United States, additional workers means lower wages. We have a conservative party in my country. They used to be called the Progressive Conservatives. Now they're just called the Conservatives. But essentially, their manifesto can be reduced to this. We believe in everything the Liberal Party believes in, but not so fast. This is from Brian Platt at the Ottawa Citizen. Erin O'Toole faces backlash from surprised and frustrated Conservatives over carbon pricing plan. Yes, Erin O'Toole has decided that he, like Justin Trudeau, is a stalwart fighter against mankind's eternal enemy, carbon. Critics argue O'Toole has yet again abruptly contradicted his own leadership campaign and is now playing word games about what constitutes a carbon tax. Yes. Imagine that. A politician, especially a conservative politician, saying one thing when he's seeking to be elected and doing the opposite when he gets the post that he wanted. This is no surprise to anyone who knows James Burnham's The Machiavellians, which of course was discussed exhaustively on this live stream. You see, the Conservatives now favor a carbon tax, but it's not a carbon tax. It's a levy. You get it? You see, it's a levy, not a tax. And this is barely believable, but here we are. This is from Aaron Pearce at the Post-Millennial. Canada's prisoner of conscience, the British Columbia father who tried to prevent his child from undergoing pediatric transitioning, has been sentenced for criminal contempt of court. Legal commentators and child protection lawyers around the world expressed alarm at this result. On April 16th, the father, whose name has been suppressed in Canadian press due to a gag order, was sentenced to 6 months in prison for criminal contempt of court by violating publication and identification bans. The postal worker was also fined $30,000, the bulk of the crowd fund he raised to defend himself. Taking into account the time already served by the convict and the possibility of early release, the father could end up serving 3 to 4 months in prison. The reasoning of Judge Mr. Justice Tamman in imposing the sentence should shortly become available to the public. The convicted man's response was described by his lawyer, Carrie Lind, as stoic acceptance. Given that this was his first offense and that he pleaded guilty, saving the court the expense of a full trial, Lind and his client consider it excessive. The convicted man will be unavailable for interviews until he has served his sentence in full. The father was jailed for breaching a publication ban, preventing him from speaking publicly about the transitioning of this child. He admitted willfully breaching the ban and entered a guilty plea to charges of criminal contempt. Thus did he become a Canadian prisoner of conscience. The circumstances leading up to those events are set up in exhaustive detail. This writer is not critical of the judge in this case. Members of the judiciary and the legal and medical professions are in a bind. Canadian law and medicine have been captured by transgender ideology, which makes it an act of considerable courage and selflessness to resist from within the system. Realistically, not everyone is going to be a hero. The majority of people caught up in a corrupt system will go along to get along. Either they will be stupid enough not to realize what they are engaged in, or if they are not so fortunate, they will exonerate themselves of personal responsibility by saying they were just following orders. Just another cog in the machine, mortgage to pay, etc. Nonetheless, one must still point to what is happening. The court seems to invite the public to consider the child a victim of her father's attempts to protect her. Arguably, that narrative is a reversal of reality. The child might instead be a victim of the medics and court's failure to safeguard the child's health and fertility. The court seems to invite the public to scapegoat the father and run him out of town, so to speak, so that the community as a whole does not have to wrestle with this particularly invidious hydra. So, to sum up, in Canada, a man has been sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for objecting to the sexual mutilation of his 12-year-old daughter. Well, I hope the Canadian government or any particular Canadian government is not looking for any sacrifices from the Canadian people in the future for them to join together. No, because they're not going to get it. Because Canada is now run by a regime that, well, it simply can't be supported by people of conscience. From the same source, a crowd of more than 300, plus approximately 40 protesters, gathered April 10th at the Vancouver Art Gallery for a rally against the medical gender transition of youth. The rally was also meant to support a BC father whose name is under a publication ban. Speakers included People's Party of Canada leader Maxime Bernier, ex-Conservative Member of Parliament Derek Sloan, lawyer Lisa Bildy from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and others. Protesters set off smoke bombs, threw eggs into the crowd, yelled into megaphones, drove around the block honking, and danced, one woman topless. An attendee said that one protester called the female journalist covering the event, I'm not going to repeat that word, and dropped her pants and flicked her tampon string at us. Yeah. Any feds involved there? I should think there were. And so one of the things to come out of COVID-19 is apparently we're all going to be made members of the servile state. This is from Claire Gallagher at the National Observer. Canadians support a basic income. Will the Liberals finally deliver? Where the Liberals would possibly get the money for UBI in Canada. What, on top of their $10 a day daycare? Liberal Party doesn't worry about that. Apparently the people of Canada don't worry about that either. They'll just conjure up the money out of thin air. Liberal Party delegates voted to pass not one but two basic income resolutions at their national convention that ran April 8th to 10th, making basic income the governing party's second most important policy issue. For those in support of basic income, a no-strings payment to anyone who needs it, and who's going to decide who needs it or not? This vote passing could seem like a cause for celebration, but before we get ahead of ourselves, it's worth asking, what, if anything, will the Liberals do to make basic income a reality? For anyone keeping count, the Liberals have so far failed to follow through on their promises of universal pharmacare, ending boil water advisories, and electoral reform, to name a few. Let's consider the moment we are in. After multiple basic income pilots with positive results and numerous reports arguing its merits, basic income has arguably become a mainstream policy issue. Yes, they call that manufacturing consent. According to a recent poll by the Angus Reid Institute, a majority of Canadians support basic income. It makes sense. Before the pandemic, 3.2 million people in Canada live below the poverty line, poverty that has historically been disproportionately concentrated in Indigenous, racialized, and migrant communities. And over the past year, millions of people lost their jobs while businesses collapsed under financial strain. No, that is not what happened. Governments in Canada panicked and decided to destroy the economy. The story continues. We've recently had a glimpse of what's possible when we simplify access to income support. When the pandemic hit, the federal government mobilized quickly to help people make ends meet through the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB. While its implementation wasn't perfect, not everyone who needed it received help, and eligibility criteria caused confusion and repayment requests caused financial anxiety and hardship, it helped millions stay afloat. So, who's going to be paying revenue to the federal government under this plan? We're going to have, 50% or more of the population of this country not working? And how is that? How is that sustainable? Babylon Bee receives legal threat from Seuss Enterprises to remove satirical Cat in the Hat post. On Sunday, CEO of the Babylon Bee, Seth Dillon, tweeted an email he received from Seuss Enterprises demanding that they remove a post about the Cat in the Hat giving kids puberty blockers when their mother isn't home. The satire piece in question, posted March the 5th, talked about a new Dr. Seuss book called The Cat in the Hat, He, Him. In this new book, using reworked art from Dr. Seuss, said a letter from Dr. Seuss's estate, the Cat in the Hat once again finds the two children home alone and bored. This time he diagnoses their malaise as gender dysphoria and proceeds to give the children puberty blockers, the article reads. An excerpt from the book reads as follows. I have some new drugs, said the Cat in the Hat. A lot of good drugs. I'll inject them in you. Your mother will not mind at all if I do. The woke folks over at Seuss Enterprises were apparently bored and looking for something dumb to do this weekend, so they threatened to sue us for defamation whether our content is satire or not, Seth Dillon wrote. The best rhyme in the replies will be sent in response to their takedown request. The legal team from Seuss Enterprises wrote that regardless of whether the piece was satire or not, it broke copyright and defamation laws. They threatened that if it wasn't taken down, they would proceed accordingly. Dillon shot back that since the piece is satire, it is protected under fair use and would not be taken down. He added that the best rhyme... Yes, I said that already. And the interesting article from the Daily Mail here about what men find attractive in women. It's from Alice Murphy for the Daily Mail Australia. Single men have revealed that they believe what they believe makes a woman truly beautiful, and the answers are almost certain to surprise you. The discussion began when dating coach Luann Ward posted in her Facebook group, She Said, He Said, asking male members to explain what they find most attractive in a potential partner. Men commonly say it's not just about looks, but then don't take the time to get to know you and discover the beauty underneath. So how can it not be about looks? The Perth relationship expert wrote. Are we placing too much importance on the external world and missing the real beauty? The vast majority said long-term attraction is less about physical appearance and more about character, specifically pointing to the values a woman holds and how she treats others. You don't need to doll yourself up or have money in my eyes. A lady just has to have a heart and a mind that care, one man said. Another said he would take brains and personality over looks any day. Looks are a bonus in my book, he added. It works both ways for both sexes. People who are confident know what they want, set about doing that. That's what you want. There are plenty of women and men who are average in looks, but killers in the other areas that mean so much in a relationship. Those are the keepers. A third man said he is most taken by a woman with a good heart, a warm personality, and a nice smile, explaining that if someone has a kind character, that makes them shine from within. If she had those, beauty truly does shine from within. When you love someone, they will always be the most beautiful woman in the world to you. It all comes down to love. But some argued that looks do matter because a romantic relationship cannot begin without some level of physical attraction. I have heard women complain, that they can't seem to keep a man. I've held my tongue, but what I want to say to them, have you tried being a nicer person? Because that would help a lot. How about, when you first meet a man, you don't talk about yourself endlessly, to complain that the universe serves no other purpose but to frustrate your every desire? According to Luann Ward, what men value most in women: personality. Honesty is first, then confidence, then playfulness, then kindness, gratefulness, then fifth, loyalty. As far as looks goes, eyes, smile, bum, breasts, and legs. I'm surprised there isn't anything in here about a woman's voice. That for some reason, all women's voice, not all women, but a great many women's, a majority of them, they have terrible voices. They sound like nails on the proverbial blackboard. How about taking your voice lower, speaking lower and more softly? That is very attractive to men, indeed. But it seems to be ignored by women now. I was talking about the servile state earlier, and I'm going to return to that theme. A reading from Hilaire Belloc's 1912 book, which is quite prescient given that we're talking about universal basic income now. Belloc writes, the definition of the servile state is as follows: that arrangement of society in which so considerable a number of the families and individuals are constrained by positive law to labor for the advantage of other families and individuals as to stamp the whole community with the mark of such labor we call the servile state. Note first, second, negative limitations in the above, which must be clearly seized if we are not to lose clear thinking in a fog of metaphor and rhetoric. That society is not servile, in which men are intelligently constrained to labor by enthusiasm, by a religious tenet, or indirectly from fear of destitution, or directly from love of gain, or from the common sense which teaches them that by their labor they may increase their well-being. A clear boundary exists between the servile and the non-servile condition of labor, and the conditions upon which either side of that boundary utterly differ one from another. Where there is compulsion applicable by positive law to men of a certain status, and such compulsion enforced in the last resort by the powers at the disposal of the state, there is the institution of slavery. And if that institution be sufficiently expanded, the whole state may be said to repose upon a servile basis, and is a servile state. Where such formal legal status is absent, the conditions are not servile, and the difference between servitude and freedom, appreciable in 1,000 details of actual life, is most glaring in this: that the free man can refuse his labor and use that refusal as an instrument wherewith to bargain, while the slave has no such instrument or power to bargain at all, but is dependent for his well-being upon the custom of society, backed by the regulation of such of its laws as may protect and guarantee the slave. Next, let it be observed that the state is not servile because the mere institution of slavery is to be discovered somewhere within its confines. The state is only servile when so considerable a body of forced labor is affected by the compulsion of positive law as to give character to the whole community. Similarly, that state is not servile in which all citizens are liable to submit their energies to the compulsion of positive law and must labor at the discretion of state officials. By loose metaphor and for rhetorical purposes, men who dislike collectivism, for instance, or the discipline of a regiment will talk of the servile conditions of such organizations. But for the purposes of strict definition and clear thinking, it is essential to remember that a servile condition only exists by contrast with a free condition. The servile condition is present in society only when there is also present the free citizen for whose benefit the slave works under the compulsion of positive law. Again, it should be noted that this word servile in no way connotes the worst, nor even necessarily a bad arrangement of society. This point is so clear that it should hardly delay us, but a confusion between the rhetorical and the precise use of the word servile I have discovered to embarrass public discussion of the matter so much that I must once more emphasize what should be self-evident. The discussion as to whether the institution of slavery be a good or bad one, or be relatively better or worse than other alternative institutions, has nothing whatever to do with the exact definition of that institution. Thus, monarchy consists in throwing the responsibility for the direction of society upon an individual. One can imagine some Roman of the first century praising the new imperial power, but through a muddle-headed tradition against kings, swearing that he would never tolerate a monarchy. Such a fellow would have been a very futile critic of public affairs under Trajan, but no more futile than a man who swears that nothing shall make him a slave, though well prepared to accept laws that compel him to labor without his consent under the force of public law and upon terms dictated by others. Many would argue that a man so compelled to labor, guaranteed against insecurity and against insufficiency of food, housing, and clothing, promised subsistence for his own age and a similar set of advantages for his posterity, would be a great deal better off than a free man lacking all these things. But the argument does not affect the definition attaching to the word servile. A devout Christian of blameless life, drifting upon an ice floe in the Arctic night without food or any prospect of succor, is not so comfortably circumstanced as the Khedive of Egypt, but it would be folly in establishing the definition of the words Christian and Mohammedan to bring this contrast into account. We must then, throughout this inquiry, keep strictly to the economic aspect of the case. Only when that is established and when the modern tendency to the reestablishment of slavery is clear, are we free to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the revolution through which we are passing. It must be further grasped that the essential mark of the servile institution does not depend upon the ownership of the slave by a particular master. That the institution of slavery tends to that form under the various forces composing human nature and human society is probable enough. That if or when slavery were reestablished in England, a particular man would in time be found the slave not of capitalism in general, but of, say, the Shell Oil Trust in particular, is a very likely development. And we know that in societies where the institution was of immemorial antiquity, such direct possession of the slave by the free man or corporation of free men had come to be the rule. But my point is that such a mark is not essential to the character of slavery. As an initial phase in the institution of slavery, or even as a permanent phase marking society for an indefinite time, it is perfectly easy to conceive of a whole class rendered servile by positive law and compelled by such law to labor for the advantage of another non-servile free class, without any direct act of possession permitted to one man over the person of another. The final contrast thus established between slave and free might be maintained by the state guaranteeing to the unfree security in their subsistence, to the free security in their property and profits, rent and interest. What would mark the slave in such a society would be his belonging to that set or status which was compelled by no matter what definition to labor, and was thus cut off from the other set or status not compelled to labor, but free to labor or not as it willed. Again, the servile state would certainly exist even though a man, being only compelled to labor during a portion of his time, was free to bargain and even to accumulate in his spare time. The old lawyers used to distinguish between a serf in gross and a serf regardant. A serf in gross was one who was a serf at all times and places, and not in respect to a particular lord. A serf regardant was a serf only in his bondage to serve a particular lord. He was free as against other men, and one might perfectly well have slaves who were only slaves regardant to a particular type of employment during particular hours. But they would be slaves nonetheless, and if their hours were many and their class numerous, the state which they supported would be a servile state. And I'll be reading more from Hilaire Belloc tomorrow. Jim Kunstler has a new column out today. The movie follows the script. Representative Maxine Waters, Democrat of California, laid it out neatly Friday night on a visit to Minneapolis, where she went apparently to stir a pot of racial hatred that was already on boil without her help. Following the accidental killing of felonious bail jumper Daunte Wright, first-degree aggravated robbery, fleeing from police, and possession of a handgun without a permit. "We've got to stay on the street," Waters yelled at the mob gathered in the suburb of Brooklyn Center. "Get more confrontational." Yes, exactly what the Sorbonne city needs as it awaits this week's verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin, in which she added, "I am very hopeful that we will get a verdict that says guilty, guilty, guilty. If we do not, we will not go away." Former police officer Chauvin is charged with murder 2, murder 3, and manslaughter, all predicated on various degrees of intention and recklessness in the death of George Floyd, the internationally acclaimed saint of oppressed peoples who died under Chauvin's knee in an indelible video shared around the world last May. The video has the status of religious icon, portraying, as it seems to, the vivid distillation of the Black experience in America, pure, unalloyed, hateful, murderous subjugation. The trouble is what's not in the indelible picture: Floyd's prodigious ingestion of the world's hardest narcotic, fentanyl, at a level likely to cause death, plus methadone, plus THC, on top of a 90% blockage of a coronary artery and other cardiopathies, and COVID-19, all according to the official medical examiner. Also, as it happened, in the instance of his arrest, Floyd was failing to follow police instructions and acting dangerously deranged, behavior apt to lead to police restraint, under which he died, rest his soul. So now it will be left to the jury to sort all this out under the threat of getting doxxed by the Black Lives Matter org, as well as following the $27 million lawsuit settlement on the Floyd family for wrongful death by the Minneapolis City Council before the trial commenced. Not exactly a propitious lead-in for a fair outcome. One might even view the public expressions of Black opinion leaders and politicians as coercive, but then coercion is the animating spirit of liberal wokery, the wish and the will to punish at all costs. In any case, the fine spring weather around the country invites the young and energetic to caper angrily in the streets after a harsh winter of lockdowns. The mobs will turn out, things will burn, businesses will get looted and destroyed, and people will get hurt. So it will be for two reasons. Groups of people follow social scripts, and societies give tacit permission for the acting out of feelings, in this case, feelings of vengeance that require retribution and vengeance. Feelings of grievance, rather. What's actually at issue here is whether Black people in America really want to join with the other ethnic groups present in the land in a national common culture. That is, a consensus about behavior, ceremonies, and manners, or would rather opt out of it, oppose it, or violently destroy what's left of it. The key to these questions is how to explain the failure to thrive of a large Black demographic despite the apparent victories of a long civil rights campaign, colossal expenditures of tax money for assistance, and affirmative action galore. Kunstler writes, "I would explain it as the malign influence of neurotic white liberalism acting on the aforesaid Black ambivalence about joining in or remaining part from that common culture. The upshot for now is that white liberalism has given Black America permission to act violently and destructively, to disobey the law, to oppose officers attempting to enforce the law, and to justify the whole package of uncivil behavior on the grounds that systemic racism or white supremacy are the forces that keep Black Americans from thriving. The script for all this prevails because liberalism cannot otherwise explain its own failure to uplift Black America after many years of sedulous striving. They are left disappointed, ashamed, and guilty, and neurotically give themselves permission to support Black hostility and hatred against white people as a form of self-punishment. The catch is that not all white people in America are neurotic liberals, and they are not in favor of continuing white self-punishment. Kunstler concludes, the question at hand is how much longer this crazy script will be allowed to run. It appears that the country is about evenly split between those in favor of promoting Black hostility and those disinclined to further submission. It's up to American political leadership to decide, and for now, the liberals are the party holding the levers of power, government in essence, representing the blunt force that determines which way things go. And at the head of this government sits the inert and tractable Joe Biden, who seems to have had it decided for him. So, are we at war with Ukraine yet? Our greatest ally? Are at war with Russia over Ukraine? It's hard to keep track of exactly what's going on there. It's an interview with Israel Shamir by Mike Whitney on uns.com. Don't poke the bear. Question 1. For the past 4 years, Democrat leaders have blamed Russia for allegedly meddling in the 2016 elections. Now the Democrats, who control all 3 branches of government, have the power to reset U.S. foreign policy and take a more hostile approach to Moscow. But will they? At present, there are roughly 40,000 U.S. NATO troops massed along the Russian border, conducting military exercises, while scores of Russian tanks, artillery, and an estimated 85,000 Russian troops are now located about 25 miles from Ukraine's eastern border. Both armies are on hair-trigger alert and prepared for any sudden provocation. If the Ukrainian army invades the Russian-speaking region of Ukraine, the Donbass, Moscow will likely respond. So will there be a conflagration in the Ukraine this spring? And if so, how will Putin respond? Will he limit the scope of his campaign to the Donbass or push on to Kiev? Shamir says if the Russian army crosses the Ukrainian border, it won't stop in the Donbass. The war will be brief and the Ukraine will be split into pieces. But will it happen? Russia's totem animal, the bear, is a strong and peaceful animal that is not easily aroused, but once provoked, it is unstoppable. Russian rulers have typically fit this image. They weren't adventurous, but level-headed and prudent. Putin, who is the quintessential Russian ruler, is risk-averse. He won't start a war he never wanted to begin with, but he will act decisively if he needs to do so. Consider 2014, after the Ukrainian coup, the lawful Ukrainian president Yanukovych ran to Russia and asked Putin to help him regain power. At that time, the Ukrainian army was weak and Russia could have easily retaken the country without facing any significant resistance. But surprisingly, Putin did not give the order to take Kiev. Putin is unpredictable. He ordered the seizure of Crimea despite the counsel of his advisors. It was an unexpected move and it worked like a charm. He also pummeled Georgia in 2008 or after Saakashvili invaded South Ossetia. This was another surprise move that succeeded better than anyone could have imagined. If the Ukrainians try to retake Donbass, the Russian army will beat them badly and continue on to Kiev. The presence of NATO's troops will not deter Putin. As for the Democrats, they can push Kiev to attack, but they will end up losing the Ukraine in the process. If the point is to poison relations between Russia and Europe, they can try to do so. But if they think the Russo-Ukrainian war is going to drag on, they're mistaken. And if they think Putin won't defend the Donbass, they've made a serious miscalculation. Mike Whitney asked the question, he asked the question, I have a hard time understanding what the Biden administration hopes to gain by provoking a war in the Ukraine. Seizing the Donbass will force the government to impose a costly long-term military occupation that will be ferociously resisted by Russian-speaking people who live in the area. How does that benefit Washington? I don't think that it does. I think the real objective is to provoke Putin into overreacting, thus proving that Russia poses a threat to all of Europe. The only way Washington can persuade its EU allies that they should not engage in critical business transactions like Nord Stream with Moscow is if they can prove that Russia is an external threat to their collective security. Shamir says, what do you mean by overreacting? Putin is not threatening to nuke Washington or take over Brussels or storm Warsaw, but to solve the problem of Ukraine on such an occasion would be entirely reasonable. When the regime in Kiev began to prepare for war a few months ago, they thought it would be a repeat of 2015, where they attacked Donbass, the Donbass suffers losses, and then the Russian army steps in to prevent their defeat. They saw it as a limited war with a good chance of regaining Donbass. But Moscow has indicated that they will respond to any unprovoked aggression using their full strength, thereby crushing the Ukrainian state. In other words, the Russian army won't stop at the Donbass, but will proceed to the western borders of the Ukraine until the entire country is liberated. Is that overreacting? Definitely not, says Shamir. The people of Ukraine would be saved from the nationalist anti-Russian regime, and the people of Russia would be saved from a NATO base on their western flank. Hopefully, the EU will understand this. Oh, yes. And apparently Russia is the worst country in the world. Meanwhile, in North Africa, ISIS issues warning to Christians of Egypt as they execute a captured Coptic and 2 tribesmen with gunshots to the head. This is Chris Pleasance of the Daily Mail. Nabil Habashi Salama, 62, a Coptic Christian, executed by ISIS's arm in Egypt. Video released Saturday shows militants standing over Salama before he is shot. Jihadist says killing is a warning to Christians for supporting the Egyptian army. 2 tribesmen were also killed for fighting with Egyptian forces, ISIS claims. Yes, the religion of peace, as they call it. This is from the U.S. Sun. Minneapolis braces for violence after Derek Chauvin verdict as pig's head left at former home of witness who defended cops. Does anyone think that there was any possibility of Derek Chauvin getting a fair trial when the jurors know that if they vote the wrong way, they will be doxxed, they will be physically attacked, they might be killed, their homes set on fire? I don't think so. More than 1,100 officers from public safety agencies across Minnesota have also been brought in to help stem any potential unrest as the city waits with bated breath over a verdict in Chauvin's trial. A verdict could be returned as early as the end of this week after closing arguments began in the trial as of Monday morning. St. Paul, Minnesota Mayor Melvin Carter told CNN the city has an enormous amount of safety measures in place to quell any potential violence. He said his biggest concern ahead of the verdict is making sure that everyone in our community knows that there is justice in our justice system for them. We are all eyewitnesses. We all know what we saw, and nothing that happened in the trial changed any of that. So in other words, the mayor of St. Paul is saying that there's no need for a trial. There's no need for due process. In the case of Officer Chauvin, we know that he's guilty, so send him to prison. Elsewhere in the country, the former home of a key defense expert witness who testified last week that George Floyd's death was accidental was vandalized in California. The incident occurred early Saturday morning in Santa Rosa as vandals sought to target former California cop Barry Broad. In a statement, the Santa Rosa Police Department said that while Broad no longer lives at the home, they believe the perpetrators were attempting to target him over his testimony. Broad, a use of force expert, took the stand last Tuesday where he claimed that Chauvin was justified in kneeling down on George Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, did not use deadly force, and said he was acting with objective reasonableness. In a statement, Santa Rosa PD said Mr. Broad has not lived at the residence for a number of years and is no longer a resident of California. Because Mr. Broad no longer lives in the city of Santa Rosa, it appears the victim was falsely targeted. Oh, and by the way, the police chief of Santa Rosa said that no, this expert witness does not represent our point of view. Yes, his comments do not reflect the values and beliefs of the Santa Rosa Police Department. I just wonder, in so many of these cities across America, why any policeman would risk their lives when they are working for people who are so eager to throw them under the next bus that comes along. And, oh, yes, back to Maxine Waters. This is from Matthew Boyle at Breitbart. House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy on Sunday night pressed House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to take action against Representative Maxine Waters for inciting violence in remarks she made in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota this weekend. What the hell was she doing there? Was she trying to incite a riot ahead of the verdict? Maxine Waters, it's been pointed out that Donald Trump was kicked off Twitter, supposedly because he was inciting violence. So let's see, Maxine Waters, is she still on Twitter? Indeed she is. How about that? It seems that there's one rule for some people and another rule for others. From uns.com, Minnesota high school student who was falsely accused of sending racist Instagram messages to a black classmate fears for her safety despite officials confirming they were a hoax. Yeah. They get you one way or another, apparently. Colorado judge used the N-word and proclaimed that all lives matter. Now she's resigning, says Jacqueline Pizer of the Washington Post. The most powerful world in the world, the most powerful world in history, which may not be used by white people. Black people hear it or say it 50, 100 times or more a day. And this judge apparently asked that question. She asked a facilitator, a family court facilitator who was a black woman at a conference in Pueblo, Colorado. During the ride, Chase asked the facilitator why black people can use the N-word but not white people, and whether it was different if the N-word is said with an ER or an A at the end of the word. Chase repeatedly used the full N-word in the conversation. Well, off with her head then. And this is from Paul Kersey at uns.com. Just make it illegal to arrest blacks. To honor the memory of George Floyd, social justice advocates urge big box retailers to rethink calls to police over shoplifting and so-called low-level crimes. Yeah, we'll just let people commit crimes, and they will use their best judgment about how far to go. No slippery slope there. Ted Lieu, who is a congressman from California, a Democratic congressman, responded to Representative Scott Perry, native-born Americans like you are no more American, no less American than an immigrant like me. And with every passing year, there will be more people who look like me in the U.S. You can't stop it. So take your racist replacement theory and shove it. So Ted Lieu says simultaneously that replacement theory is rubbish, but it's happening and we mean to hurt you. I wonder how long they can get away with that for. Outstanding journalism from The Guardian. Jason Wilson, U.S. police and public officials donated to Kyle Rittenhouse. Data breach reveals. Data breach, huh? Ho ho, a very satirical. A data breach at a Christian crowdfunding website has revealed that serving police officers and public officials have donated money to fundraisers for accused vigilante murderers, far-right activists, and fellow officers accused of shooting Black Americans. In many of these cases, the donations were attached to their official email addresses, raising questions about the use of public resources in supporting such campaigns. The breach, shared with journalists by Transparency Group, Distributed Denial of Secrets, revealed the details of some donors who had previously attempted to conceal their identities using a GiveSendGo's anonymity feature, but whose identifying details the website preserved. One donation for $25 made on September 3rd last year was made anonymously but associated with the official email address for Sergeant William Kelly, who currently serves as the Executive Order of Internal Affairs in the Norfolk Police Department in Virginia. That donation also carried a comment reading, "God bless, thank you for your courage, keep your head up, you've done nothing wrong." Another Rittenhouse donor using an official email address was Craig Shepard, who public records show is a paramedic in Utah. This donor gave $10 to Rittenhouse on the 30th of August. $10. I suggested this last week, but since the media has decided that their primary job is to be snitches and sneaks, I think it should be mandatory that Jason Wilson and other such reporters be compelled to give over all of their private communications for analysis by a group hostile to them. I mean, it's only fair. George W. Bush is back in the news. He says that Trump lacked the humility necessary to be an effective leader. In an interview that aired on CBS Sunday Morning, Norah O'Donnell said, though he has refrained from criticizing his successors, he told us there's a clear difference between him and former President Donald Trump. Bush said, I feel a responsibility to uphold the dignity of the office. I did then and I do now. And I think it's undignified to want to see my name in print all the time. He continued, I think it basically sends a signal that I miss being famous and, I want people to see me, listen to me. And, I don't. I really don't. O'Donnell said, so you feel humbled by the office, it sounds like? Bush said, totally. To me, humility shows an understanding of self. It shows a belief in a higher power that is necessary to be an effective leader. And we were short of humility in the last 4 years. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let's look at the bidding here. George W. Bush incited an invasion of Iraq, which killed hundreds of thousands of people and cost the Americans trillions of dollars, over a lie. He said he knew that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Well, there weren't any there. So he lied to the American people. In fact, George W. Bush was so deranged that he gave a speech at the National Cathedral while president after 9/11, saying that America had a duty to remove evil from the world. And he dares to talk about others lacking humility. And George W. Bush also laid down the law with Norah O'Donnell about immigration. Do you want to be involved in the immigration discussion? Bush said, yeah, I do, in a way. I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't want to, tell Congress how to do this or that. I do want to say to Congress, please put aside all the harsh rhetoric about immigration. Please put aside trying to score political points on either side. I hope I can set a tone that is more respectful about the immigrant, which may lead to a reform of the system. Yes, in other words, opening up the borders to anyone who wants to come to America. And of course, he repeats the whopper. We are a nation of laws and we must enforce our laws. We're also a nation of immigrants. No, America is not a nation of immigrants. America was founded by colonists, or settlers, as they used to be called. Joe Biden overrules staff plan, raises refugee inflow, reports Neil Monroe on Breitbart, because apparently that is what the United States needs now at a time of very high unemployment and an economy that is collapsing, is more people. Lauren Lasabe writes in the Washington Post, conservatives have long embraced cancel culture. And apparently Lauren Lasabe is very upset because back in the 1960s, the Young Americans for Freedom were aghast that the U.S. government allowed American trade with Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and other Soviet-dependent states. Get that? Soviet-dependent states, as part of the Johnson administration's bridge-building policy with the Soviet Union. They saw this trade as a form of national suicide because it propped up communism, which was locked in a life-or-death struggle with American capitalism. That's a curious way to put it. Life and death struggle with American capitalism. Here's a fun fact. The Washington Post has been a CIA asset since the 1940s. Again from Breitbart, Warner Todd Houston, the NBA has suffered another ratings disaster, with ABC falling 45% since the 2011-12 season, while TNT was down 40% and ESPN was off 20%. This ratings tumble is nothing new, granted. The past two NBA finals have fallen one over the other, with last year's down 51% to an all-time low for the championships. The worst was the final game, off nearly 70% year over year. So I suppose the question here is whether this rating collapse has to do with the politicization of sport in the United States, or whether, I don't know, the love affair between, watching professional athletes play for millions over your TV, that love affair has grown cold. Vice, isn't that, I think it'd be easier to describe it as Antifa's premier media outlet. COVID conspiracies are supercharging Germany's far right. The stable economic powerhouse at the heart of the European Union is also home to the continent's biggest and wildest anti-lockdown movements. Yeah, I think that, the German people, as Vice would have us believe, should just embrace the loss of their liberty. And speaking of millionaires, this is a story from the Daily Mail. Super League fury grows. Prince William says Big Six's plans risk damaging the game we love, as Boris Johnson vows to do everything to protect football, and Manchester United stars hold training ground revolt amid fan backlash. Arsenal, Spurs, Man United, Man City, Liverpool, and Chelsea have signed up to a much maligned $4.3 billion project. A dozen European football clubs have agreed to join a midweek Super League with plans to start in August. Competition would have no relegation, damaging Champions League, and mortally wounding domestic leagues. Clubs will cream off billions in new TV money and advertising, with critics saying they're pursuing an NFL model. Is this the right time to do that? I wonder. For big business to decide to squeeze the last penny out of European soccer. No, sorry, not soccer. Football. They've decided that it is the right time to do this. Now, you've probably heard this. I'm hearing an awful lot about it, that apparently what markets in the United States are out of control. People talking about a bubble and a bursting of that bubble. There's a story from Jesse Pound at CNBC. Hedge fund manager David Einhorn warned of dangers for retail investors that he sees in the market, and one of his main examples was a tiny New Jersey deli with a market capitalization of more than $100 million. The Paulsboro, New Jersey-based Your Hometown Deli is the sole location for Hometown International, which has an eye-popping market value despite totaling $36,000 in sales in the last 2 years combined, according to security filings. Does that sound like a bubble to you? Sounds like a bubble to me. I'm going to switch to Music Monday now, and I'm going to look at the classical crossover, and I'm looking at the Billboard charts, the Billboard classical music charts, and the top 25 records they're on. The first one is Promises by Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders, and the London Symphony Orchestra. Second is Beautiful Blessings by Vocal Point. Third is 10 from the Piano Guys. 4 is Sleep by Max Richter. 5 is Cello Blue by David Darling. 6 is Tree of Light by Riopi. 7 is Piano Book by Long Long. 8 is Porcelain, Helen Jane Long. I've heard of that one. It's put out by Deutsche Grammophon. It arrangements of music made by Moby. Number 9 is First Love Piano Collection. Number 10, The Essential Yo-Yo Ma. Number 11, 3D Classical Collection by Ben Gurnon, London Philharmonic Orchestra. Number 12 is S&M 2 by Metallica and the San Francisco Symphony. Yo-Yo Ma in again at number 13, Daniel Barenboim with Chopin, Complete Nocturnes by Chopin at number 14. Number 15, You Finally Knew by Chad Lawson. 16, Andrea Bocelli, Believe. 17, the Pride and Prejudice soundtrack. Number 18, The Best, Reminiscent, 10th Anniversary by Yuruma. Max Richter again in at number 19. 20, The 50 Greatest Pieces of Classical Music by London Philharmonic Orchestra. Number 21, covers from the Netflix original Bridgerton. 22, Lindsey Sterling by Lindsey Sterling. 23, The Piano Guys 2 by The Piano Guys. 24, Islands, Essential Einaudi by Ludovico Einaudi. And 25, C by Andrea Bocelli. You're not really seeing a lot of classical music, are you there? I'm not seeing a lot of it at all. And it seems to me to be a curious decision by the classical record companies to go in that direction. This is a trend that I wrote about almost 20 years ago. Gay Yee's favorite color is red. Eos's favorite food is Thai green curry. Haley's favorite animal is a pootie cat named Mushu. Tanya's favorite color is blue. Gayi, Eos, Haley, and Tanya, in case you hadn't guessed, are members of a string quartet. They are called Bond. Bond's collective likes include lipstick lesbian posturing. Collective dislikes include being photographed wearing clothes. The Bond girls are, if Decca Records has anything to say about it, the future of classical music. Some old fogies, such as those at CIN, the organization that administers the British record charts, disagree. Bond's first recording, Born, reached number 2 on the British classical album chart before anyone at CIN discovered that it is actually disco music. Bond is no more classical than the Electric Light Orchestra's roll over Beethoven or Walter Murphy's The Fifth of Beethoven. CIN removed Born from the classical chart, and Bond got a lot of free publicity to add to the millions of dollars worth bought by their manager, Mel Bush, who had earlier given us the classical stylings of Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody, and Vanessa Mae, the half-naked jailbait fiddler. Haley, Bond's first violin, struck a populist note in response to the removal. In a modern world, it is disappointing that the classical elite cannot embrace change. Ha! What the classical elite, as measured by the major record labels, has embraced is not mere change, but rather wholesale devolution. They call it crossover, as in the line that is crossed in the journey from sublime to ridiculous. Decca, the label that gave us Antal Dorati's first integral recording of the Haydn symphonies, now gives us a 16-year-old Haley Westenra, who surely would have given Ruben and Clay a run for their money on American Idol. Russell Watson, the loutish tenor, who sneers at real opera singers for their robotic voices, and Donny Osmond. That's right. Donny Osmond, singer of the immortal Puppy Love, apparently once having been a little bit rock and roll, he's now a little bit classical. Sony Classical, the inheritor of the mantle of Bernstein and Horowitz, now touts singer-songwriters Mary Fall and Summer. EMI, the home of Wilhelm Furtwängler and Maria Callas, now hypes Keith Emerson, once famous for stabbing his Hammond organ with a knife. And RCA, the first name in classical music, synonymous with Caruso, Toscanini, and Rubinstein, serves up the Love Notes series, making out to Mozart, Bedroom Bliss with Beethoven, and Shacking Up to Chopin. By the way, I didn't make those names up. Those are real album titles. These desperate efforts by the major classical labels are the response to the long-expected death of classical music. Symphony orchestras across North America are dying from lack of interest and are threatened in Europe by collapse in government funding. Classical music now represents about 1 in 50 records sold in America. So what to do? Give the people what they think they want. Classical CDs without the hard bits or even without the classical bits. Even as the major classical labels spend tens of millions signing and promoting crossover acts, dozens of great orchestras, conductors, singers, and instrumentalists are being tossed over the side. But will the teenager who buys Bond today be buying the Kronos Quartet tomorrow? Unlikely. The major labels, all owned by giant conglomerates for which serious music is a fraction of their total revenues, care not a whit that they are cannibalizing their future. And the point is just as valid as when I made it, that one would think that the classical music labels are in the business of trying to get people to buy classical music. And if you're going to sell classical music that is not classical music, then people will never get the taste for listening to something which is a little more difficult than what they are used to. I'm looking at a piece that I wrote some years ago about the devolution of the classical music industry. I wrote, mere bad taste became pornography 3 years ago with the debut release from Canadian Lara St. John. 24 years old, but looking a decade younger, St. John stands naked on the cover, her breasts hidden only by her violin. Unlike Ma, St. John has it, and she flaunts it. Adding sacrilege to insult, the recording is not some crossover effort like Fiddlin' to Get Jiggy, I didn't make that one up, but a Bach sonata and partita, the very Everest of the repertoire. Released on a minor label, this jailbait Bach has sold 30,000 copies, making it a runaway bestseller. St. John appeared naked, but for a jacket on the cover of her next release, and the major labels, determined to close the cheesecake gap, have since made the push-up bra and the plunging neckline as essential as the baton and the bow, the better to quicken the hearts of the overwhelmingly male and middle-aged demographic that buys classical records. The beefcake is presumably an attempt to further nurture the gay market, which the industry began openly cultivating years ago with the release of Out Classics, whose cover art was a photograph of two muscular and naked men embracing. Ed Savigny, who works at Chorus Classical Records, the Vancouver store for the discriminating buyer, rejects the suggestion that soon classical record companies will sign only those performers fit to join the cast of Friends. Perhaps I'm naive, he declares, but artistry is undeniable. He defends Lara St. John, calling her a very competent violinist, a view shared by the critical fraternity, but admits that sexy CDs do sell better. He insists, however, that his clientele is as interested as what's inside the jewel box as with what adorns it. Do you know Hélène Grimaud? He asks, referring to the exquisite French pianist. Customers are attracted by her album covers and they ask, is this any good? He is pleased to tell them that her Gershwin and Brahms are fantastic. People want the total package, he says. And I'm looking at this picture of a record by Hélène Grimaud, and she is looking at the camera with this "come hither." It's very amusing. I put it next to a cover of Fritz Reiner conducting the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, whose look is very much no nonsense. I made a joke at the end of this about the takeover of Warner Music getting involved and buying EMI. I said, classical booty, anyone? And I responded later, I was only half serious about classical booty. I should have known better, as RCA's appalling Love Notes series, Shacking Up to Chopin, etc. proves. I must confess, however, that I didn't anticipate the industry's decision to go after pop idol American Idol viewers. Does EMI really believe teenagers are interested in whatever Becky has to offer, or is she aimed at the burgeoning pedophile market? Laura St. John's critical standing grows ever higher. She is now signed to Sony. Not that that means anything anymore. Sony being almost down market is EMI. I should say that I've been rather pleased with what Warner Music has done with the list, the catalog that they got from EMI. I wrote at the time, visitors to her handsome website will discover Laura St. John to be an engaging and intelligent woman, even if she doesn't understand what pornography means. Finally, I had not heard of Nina Kotova, the Russian cellist, composer, and catwalk model. Otherwise, I would have included her in my survey. Musical talent is surely supererogatory to a woman this beautiful. Perhaps in the future, John Casablancas will be a bigger name in music than Juilliard. Sting made a record of songs of John Dowling, and it is really quite good, actually. And I think there's a reason for that. Is there a reason that he took this Elizabethan music very seriously? And I'm going to read from the All Music Review by James Mannheim. Why then does this album work well on the whole? The short answer is that Sting took 20 years to think about how to interpret the refined melancholy of Dowland's songs like Come, Heavy Sleep. His booklet notes tell the long story of how he happened to make this album, and it's quite an interesting one, involving a labyrinth of encounters with Katya Lebec, with the Bosnian lutenist Eden Karamazov, who performs on this album, with a friend who gave Sting a lute inlaid with a labyrinth design based on a pattern in the floor of Chartres Cathedral. Sting constructs two crossover points between this temporarily remote music and his popular audience. First, he intersperses the songs with selections from Dowland's letters. This has surely been done before at Elizabethan dinners and the like, and for modern listeners, it has the beneficial effect of situating Dowland's music at the center of the social and political life of its time. Sting's second crossover point is more radical. He replaces the melody line in a few of Dowland's verses with multi-tracked harmonies, apparently consisting entirely of his own voice. These sections appear rather randomly, but they do break up the texture in a way that suggests an additional dimension of modern perspective. A lot of people have become classical composers in recent years, and one of them is no less than Sir Paul McCartney. Now, Paul McCartney is, well, I don't need to tell you that he's written a lot of popular tunes, and he's an outstanding guitar player and bassist with a fine voice. But one thing that he is not is a classical composer. And yet, we see here EMI Classics, which is now owned by Warner, released in 1991, Paul McCartney's Liverpool Oratorio. Passing strange. Paul McCartney cannot read music. So that is to say, he is incapable of writing a piece which is an hour and 37 minutes long. He also knows nothing about orchestration, except I suppose a few tricks George Martin might have taught him. So I suppose Paul McCartney wasn't satisfied with being at the top of the pop world for decades. No, he has to become a classical composer as well. And I see the name Carl Davis here. Yeah, Carl Davis is a classical composer. Paul McCartney followed up Liverpool Oratorio with a record called Standing Stone, which is 75 minutes long. And apparently we're supposed to believe that Paul McCartney is capable of writing a 75-minute piece, which he is simply not. Philip Glass made a record a few decades ago called Songs from Liquid Days. And we have a lot of famous pop music people involved. Paul Simon, Suzanne Vega. We got the Kronos String Quartet. We have Linda Ronstadt, David Byrne, the Roche Sisters, Laurie Anderson. Philip Glass said something interesting about this recording with regard to, pop musicians and classical music. He said, I can do what they do, but they can't do what I do. And we see that Philip Glass has written symphonies based on the work of David Bowie and Brian Eno. He's a very talented man. I suppose, Elvis Costello has ventured into the world of classical music now. And with Deutsche Grammophon pouring so much resources into this new Moby album of theirs, one wonders just how interested they still are in classical music. And again, the point that I made earlier, that you want to get people to buy classical music. And I suppose they could be introduced to it gently. But if you sell them stuff that isn't classical and say it's classical, I guess they're never going to learn about it. There is a woman in England who is called Mylene Klass, and she is famous for some reason or whatever. She always seems to be in the Daily Mail, or at least in the Daily Mail on a weekly basis. She's described by Wikipedia as a British singer, presenter, musician, model, and businesswoman. She was a member of the pop group Hearsay, and later released 2 solo classical crossover albums in 2003 and 2007. More recently, Klass has been a television and radio presenter. She has hosted television series including Pop Star to Opera Star and BBQ Champ on ITV and The One Show on BBC One. She was briefly a regular panelist on the ITV lunchtime chat show Loose Women in 2014. In April 2012, her net worth was estimated at $11 million. She's been in the tabloids a lot because I suppose her unfortunate choices in boyfriends. She was married to this bouncer who had an enormous tattoo on his back, which said, "Only God can judge me." And I thought, yeah, people who have tattoos like that are frequently judged, typically by judges. But Mylene Klass continues to, have a classical career. And I have here before me a film of Eric Satie's Nacien No. 1. She's directed by Nick Burgess-Jones. This is a very simple piece by Eric Satie, but at no time are we shown her hands on the keyboard. And I wonder why that might be. Perhaps because she's not all that good at playing the piano. I say that it's a very simple tune by Eric Satie, but simple tunes are frequently very difficult to play because of the amount of emotion or restraint that they require. The good news is, of course, is that it's possible to avoid crossover music entirely. And this is what I recommend. So those are my thoughts on crossover music. And yeah, I was talking, a couple of weeks ago about Oxford University claiming that they're going to drop the teaching of musical notation because apparently Black people are triggered by it. Well, that reminded me of the famous drummer Bernard Purdie. He grew up in Baltimore in dire poverty, one of 15 children. He wanted to be a session drummer, but found out he'd have to learn notation. So he learned it. Apparently, where there is a will, there is a way. So that's it for today. I'm very sorry that for some reason I couldn't see the comments in the chat, and I will attempt to have that fixed by tomorrow. Later in the week, on Theater Thursday, I'm going to be discussing Bong Joon-ho's movie Parasite from 2019. And on the book club, I'm going to be discussing Andy Ngo's book about Antifa called Unmasked. And next week on Music Monday, I'm going to have a short tutorial on collecting classical music. In many ways, this situation, classical music is sad, but on the other hand, I don't think there's been a better time ever to collect it. So that's the show for today. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which would be exceedingly appropriate and welcomed at this uncertain juncture in my life, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to this live stream can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.